Hi, my name is Mark. So today I'm going to discuss and teach you about Spring Framework, basic of dependency injection. So what really is Spring Framework? Basically, it's just the dependency injection framework. And what is dependency injection? And what is a dependency? So there are many questions that I will help you get answers today. So first, I think let's discuss about the first one, which is a dependency. So what is a dependency injection and what is dependency? So there are many questions that today I will help you get answers. I think first we should discuss about the dependency. So take a look at the diagram. This is just a basic diagram that I have provided for you guys. So in this diagram, as you can see, we have I think at least 3 layers, right? One for the front end, another one is for the middleware, and at the bottom part is for the data warehouse or data store. So as you can see, each of the layers depends on another layer. Like for example, the Bootstrap depends on the Spring Boot layer, right? And then the Spring Boot layer depends on the other vendors like MySQL. The MySQL could be any other vendor like Oracle DB, Postgres, and Snowflake's database, anything. This diagram is just a very high level of what it means, or what the dependency actually means for the backend, or even at the full stack development. So to move forward, I'm going to show you a little bit more deeper than this, right? I'm going to explain or show you a couple of codes on how does the dependency look like at the code level. We're going to start coding. So now we have here I'm using IntelliJ at the moment. So what you can see right here is just an old project of mine. So I'm just gonna close everything here and I'm going to start creating new classes on this package, no injection. So the goal of this coding session is for me to provide a basic understanding about what is the dependency means at the code level, right? So let's start by creating a class, right? For example, controller, and then let's create another class which is part of the service layer. So ideally the service layer has an interface, right? And then there will be an implementation of that interface. So first we create an interface, say like sort interface. Alright, let's put it here. So these are the classes. Now we have the controller, and now we have this sort interface. Next we need an implementation of that sort interface, right? Say like bubble sort. Alright, so what do we have here is a bubble sort class, and then we also have to implement the sort interface that we just had created right now. So in a total, we already have a sort interface, the controller class, and then the bubble sort. Now ideally, usually the controller is at the top level of the dependency in Spring, any Spring project. So usually the controller will have a dependency on, and one of the service layer class we have is the bubble sort. So let's say bubble sort. Okay, the sort is equal to new. Alright, so as you can see, this declaration or this line of code, we are trying to create an instance of the bubble sort directly inside the controller class. So it tells you that the controller class has a dependency to bubble sort service, and the bubble sort service implements a sort interface. So one of the problem with this is that what if the controller doesn't want bubble sort anymore? maybe the bubble sort wants another kind of sorting algorithm. Well, that is easily fixed by saying sort, by using the sort interface directly, right? When declaring the dependency. And then you just have to create an instance of the implementation class. And that's cool. That should work. But then that leaves you to another problem, which means you will have to create instances of your dependency anywhere else in your code. So you will see a lot of boilerplates of this kind of code. Well, yeah, we can discuss more about those problems later, but the idea is, the goal of this coding session is for you to understand, or at least to have an idea what the dependency mean at the code level. Alright, some might say that I don't have to instantiate the bubble sort directly onto the controller class. So might say it can be externalized, like passing the instance of the bubble sort from the constructor, right? Say like controller and then sort. That sort is equal to that sort. And then we can get rid of this problem. Now, as you can see, there's a slight improvement here. So we are not creating an instance of the bubble sort inside the controller class anymore. And that's cool. So that means I have to manage how this controller class, and that means there's another problem, right? That leads us to how to manage a controller class instance creation. Because now we need to make sure that whenever we create the controller class, we have to provide an instance of sort, right? So say example in the main application, say like here, maybe there, for example, maybe we have a test class. Just an example, right? And then in the public, say like we have a main static method here because we just wanted to test the bubble sort. So for us to be able to create an instance of new controller, we also need to create an instance of the bubble sort. As you can see, we still end up with the same issue, right? And now we have two boilerplates here, which is the new controller and another one which is the new bubble sort. So really, managing the dependencies and your object in your project can be really tough. Imagine if you have thousands of classes in your projects, and each of those classes has number of, or a couple of, or even a dozen of dependencies to other services. It can be very tough to manage. So that's one of the reasons why people is using Spring Framework, because Spring Framework provides us the ability to delegate this kind of churns to the Spring Framework, Spring platform itself. So it means that the Spring Framework will be the one to manage those dependencies, those instances for you. Right. Alright, so before we can actually move to another chapter for this tutorial, let's just take a step back and understand what actually happened to our coding session. So far we understand that doing things without Spring Framework, right, is things are tightly coupled, and there's too much work on managing your service instances. So if you go back to our code, as you can see here in the test class, for you to be able to create the controller instance, you need to also have an instance of the bubble sort. So imagine if you have thousands of controller class and there's also hundreds of services. That's going to be tough to manage. So moving forward with our tutorial, since now we understand that doing things without Spring Framework is pretty much hard, we will move forward by me introducing to you how to use or understand Spring Dependency Injection. So there are two main annotations, right, that most of us needs to understand and be able to use in our project to be able to utilize this advantage of using Spring Dependency Injection. One of them is at component, and the second one is at auto-wired annotations. So let's go back to our coding session, and let me show you how dependency injection works in Spring Framework. Alright, so here in our coding session, I'm actually going to show you first the last code that I showed you without using the Spring Framework, for us to just remember what really happened. So right now, we're not using any annotation as we expect, right? Like using the at component or at auto-wired. We don't have that right now. The only way that we can create an instance is by instantiating it directly using the new keyword. And as you can see in the screen, the only way that I can create an instance of the controller is using the new keyword and then the controller class name. And then it has a dependency. For you to be able to create an instance of that dependency, you also have to create an instance of it and pass it as an argument to the controller class. And that's a lot of work. So let's fix this by using our Spring Framework dependency injection. So first, let's remove these things because we don't actually want this. And then the next thing we want to do, we go here in the controller. We use at component. So when you use at component, you tell the Spring to create an object bean that it will manage. Once it's created, it will stay in Spring context. You can think of the Spring context like a map where it stores all the objects it manages. So the next thing we wanna do after using the add component annotation is tell the Spring how to manage its dependency. Note that using the add component, we already told the Spring Framework which classes needs to be managed inside the Spring context, right? Basically, we are telling the Spring Framework to, hey, create an instance of the controller class and manage it inside your application context. The next thing we need to ensure that we have to tell Spring Framework how to manage those dependencies. And as you can see, we have one dependency here, which is the sort. So if we say at auto-wired, basically it is telling the Spring Framework to auto-wire any existing beans or instances of sort. And as you can see, going back to our bubble sort code, it implements the sort, right? So whenever the Spring Framework looks for any instance of the bubble sort, it will inject it to this controller class. That's right. So that only happens if there is already a bubble sort instance in the application context. If there are no instances of that sort or bubble sort class, it will create one for us. And take note that this is an interface, right? So the sort can be any other sort implementation. Right now we only have a bubble sort implementation of that interface. So that means it is safe if we don't specify any specific name for that instance name. So going back to our bubble sort, we also need to annotate this class with at component. So going back to our bubble sort class, you can annotate this with add component. So as we discussed earlier, whenever you annotate the class with add component, it tells the Spring to, hey, create an instance of this class and save it, manage it inside your application context. And that's cool, it works. Ideally, if you're working on a real world projects, from the controller level, which has a dependency from the service layer, usually the service layer, like the bubble sort, is annotated with @service. So @service is another kind of annotation that tells the Spring to create an instance of this class, but it has a wider scope of responsibility, not only just by creating an instance of this class and managing the bean inside the application. It is pretty much related to transactions, and I will be discussing further about service on another tutorial, but not now. So let's stick with the controller add component instead. Cool. So now that the bubble sort is annotated add component, whenever the program starts the application, the Spring Framework will create an instance of the bubble sort. And then the same thing that happens for this class as well, right? For the add controller. So whenever the class is annotated with add component, it tells the Spring to create an instance of the add controller class, and then it also checks the dependencies of this class. If the dependency or the field is annotated with @AutoWide, it looks for an existing instance or bean in the application context that matches the type of the dependency, like for this one, sort. And you can imagine and assume that right now the implementation class for the sort interface will just be the bubble sort, because that's the only instance that we have created so far. So since we are using a AutoWide annotation already, we can actually just remove this class, so we don't need it since we're using AutoWide anymore. So by just doing this, we can actually leverage the advantage of using dependency injection already. So that's how you basically use @component and @AutoWide annotation in the nutshell. But just to give you an idea on best practices as well, since we're already here in coding session, ideally in real world project, it is actually encouraged not to use @AutoWide annotation anymore. Take note that there are many ways to inject dependency to our class, not just using the @AutoWide annotation. You can actually just use the constructor to populate those dependencies. For example, say controller, sort, Alright, what you are seeing here still works, and the dependency injection still works. Alright, so let me also show you another way of creating an instance in the Spring application context. As you can see, I already told you that using that component will tell the Spring Framework to create an instance of the class, right? And then ultimately create a bean of it. There's another way of doing that actually. So for the sake of example, I'm actually just using Spring Boot application for this. And one of the easiest way to create an instance is to use the annotation @bean. So the annotation @bean can be used in, let's take a look, the target method. So you can use the @bean annotation method on the method level. So if you go back here in the application class, Let's try it out. Alright, as you can see, after I finished coding, I was able to write a method called lineRunner. And the method of lineRunner is annotated with @bin annotation. So basically, it tells the Spring to execute this method and then create whatever the returned instance of this command line runner type will be managed inside the application context. Right? So that means if I say @bin and then So now what you can see in the screen right now is another line runner, command line runner instance, which I am, by the way, the method is annotated with @bin method, @bin annotation. So it looks like that. So doing this, I will show you that the created bin can be injected as a dependency also in a method. So that's another thing, right? So just going back in the @controller class, the only way that we can inject a dependency, right, other than the @auto-wide annotation is by using the constructor injection. So using the constructor, we define the list of the dependency that we want, and the Spring Framework will automatically look for those instances if there are any, and then inject it to our @controller as an argument. The same thing that is happening right now. What I'm showing you is that after I created an instance of command line runner, which is, by the way, the bin name, we have a bin name. You can think of it as a key in a key value pair, right? So the key is line runner and the value is this instance. And then we can inject that instance using the key in another instantiation of bin. So the next time that I created another instance of the command line runner, I specify in the method argument the key of the bin created from the previous instantiation of bin, which is the line runner, and then the type, which is the command line runner. So the same thing that we did on the @controller, it's going to do the same thing in the method level. It will inject the dependency as is, like a magic. But really, it's not a magic, it's just an automation. And okay, so once we have that dependency injected, we can then execute or run the command runner inside our second instance. And then we can pass an argument here like run and then test. And then when we execute this thing, I'm expecting that it will print test. So we can try it now. Alright, so we're about to run this, but before we actually run this program, I added some changes in the first instantiation of the command line runner. So as you can see, this is just a check if the arg is actually greater than 0. If it is, then get the first value, which I am assuming test. Otherwise, just print initialized. The reason I am doing this is because the system that the println, or this code block, will be executed twice at this demo, right? The first time it will be executed is because of the @bin annotation. So when the Spring Framework picked up that this method is annotated with @bin, it will execute this method and return the instance of command line runner, right? And then executes the command line runner, which is the method .run, without passing any arguments. So basically, in the application context, or right, the line runner is executed this way, like that, without any arguments. That's why we have to check if the arg set length is greater than 0. Otherwise, just print initialized. It tells you that, yeah, this instance has just been initialized and the Spring did not pass any arguments to the run method. The second part of this is when I reuse the instance of the line runner in another instantiation method, which is this one, right? So I pass the line runner instance to another method as an argument or a dependency, and then I executed the method run with an argument. So after the initialized is printed, the test will also be printed because of the second instantiation, right? So just to repeat myself, just remember that it happens because the first instantiation is because of the @bin annotation that tells the Spring to create an instance of this type by executing this method and then executing the run method without passing any argument, like I showed you earlier. And then another one will be, the second one will be this part of code where also the Spring Framework detects that this method is annotated with @bin. The only difference is that this method has a dependency, which is the line runner. Now, the line runner is already in the application context, so what Spring Framework will do is inject an existing instance of this into this instantiation. And then inside this line of code, I will execute the run method with an argument test. So let's try and run this program. Alright, as you can see, this part initialized is this one because the args or the Spring did not supply any argument when executing the command line runner. And then the second time that we used or reused the instance created from the line runner into as a dependency to another instantiation, which is this one in this method, we execute the method run with an argument test. That's why I execute, it prints test in the logs. So far, looking back to our coding session just earlier, right? I showed you how to use the @component annotation that you can only use in the class level. I showed you how to use the @AutoWord at the field level, and I also showed you, before we proceed to @bin, I also showed you how to not use the AutoWord, but only use the constructor injection method, right? So meaning you won't use @AutoWord, but you will create a constructor and define your dependency in the constructor arguments. Like I showed you, if you could go back in the code here. Yeah, we are not using @AutoWired, but we use constructor injection to define your list of dependencies. Alright, but yeah, that is only for the best practices that I showed you earlier. That's why I encourage you not to use AutoWired, but it's not a limitation. You can still use it for your convenience. And another one is I showed you how to use @bean annotation. So you can use it on the method level on any configuration class. Meaning, if you say configuration class, you cannot use @bean method in classes that is only annotated with @component. It should be at least, if you go back in the code, it should be at least Spring Boot application or @configuration, right? So when you use @bean, you can use it on the method level. It tells the Spring framework to create an instance or a bean of this type from the method level. So before we actually end up these tutorials, let me just go back and show to you or discuss to you few of the common terminologies in Spring framework. First is the beans. So beans, we are telling the Spring to create beans when annotating a class, right, or a component. Note that there are some other ways to create a Spring beans other than a component, which is @beans annotation, like the one I told you earlier. The next one is @auto-wiring. We are telling the Spring to look for a Spring bean instance and inject it to the target class. It is also the process of the Spring to identify the dependencies and populates them to the target class. The dependency injection, or should I say inversion of control, it is the core logic of the Spring framework, and that it provides developers an easy way to manage services and its dependencies. IOC describes the ability of the Spring framework to take the responsibility of instantiation of classes and auto-wiring them into its platform, which is the Spring framework. And that basically means that developers does not have to worry about repeating new keywords and creating a lot of boilerplates to create instances and managing its dependencies. Think about the big projects and thousands of classes and its dependencies. That's how much Spring helps us. IOC container, on the other end, is just a terminology that refers to the implementation of inversion of control application context. For Spring, the IOC container is the application context. This is the muscle behind all the automations, or like what others said, magic. It is where all the beans are created and managed. So this is just basic of the Spring frameworks that I showed you today. In the next video, I will discuss how to set up the Spring Boot project. If there are any ways to create beans, I will still show you ways to auto-wire the beans. I will get into more details on my next video. Best practices working with Spring Beans. And thank you so much for watching my video. If you like it, please hit like and subscribe. Thank you so much.
Band 5